Hi there, everybody, and welcome to the webinar today. We are absolutely so lucky to have Michael Robotham joining us this afternoon. I think I've pulled him away from his writing, so we should feel terribly honoured around that. The reason why I'm sure many of you know that I wanted to have a chat with Michael this afternoon is because of his main protagonist, Joseph O'Loughlin. I came across Michael's book, The Other Wife, through my mum probably 6 months ago, and that started my journey, and I've since read through all of the 9 Joe O'Loughlin series. I've absolutely loved it. I love crime novels, and Michael, you've done an outstanding job. They're fantastic. I really love them. And obviously I'm very interested about your character Joe and how he came to be and where he's come from. So we'll chat a little bit about him. But my first question to you is you're an Aussie, and that's awesome. To be a multi-million best-selling crime novelist, international superhero, and you're living just in Sydney here up the road from me, in fact. So it's so lucky to have you here with us. So you grew up out in Gundagai, and so you're from a rural New South Wales background. How did it come to be that Joe lives in London? Why the UK? Why not here?
Well, I guess, I grew up in small country towns, but I'm the son of a school teacher who moved around a lot, and often tell the story when I went for my first job interview at Fairfax to become a cadet journalist at Fairfax in Sydney. And I was 17 when I went for my first job interview, and I caught the North Coast Mail train down to Sydney. And when I got to Broadway, where the offices were, I realised I'd never been in a lift before on my own, and I'd never been in a building over 3 floors high. I'd grown up completely isolated from the city, really. And but I'd wanted to be a writer since I was about probably 10 or 11 years old. My father was an English teacher. We were surrounded by books. I knew I wanted to write. I felt as though, having had this sort of childhood, a very idyllic childhood, but I had nothing to write about. I mean, I became a journalist really to gather material, and I felt, I was lucky enough to become a cadet journalist, and then if you're a journalist, there are 2 great newspaper capitals in the world, one of which is London and the other is New York. And so my journalistic career took me to London. I worked on Fleet Street for almost 10 years, and it was there that I met my agent, and I became a ghostwriter and began, ghostwriting autobiographies for famous people. And it was a logical thing that when I finally sat down to write a novel, well, there are 2 stories behind it. I mean, one story is I wrote the greatest ever unpublished Australian novel, which, as far as I know, it's still the greatest ever because it's still in my bottom drawer. It was almost published in about 1985 in the UK, and I was told then that it's set in a small Australian fishing town. And I was told after that meeting, missed out by a single vote in the publishing meeting at Penguin. And they said if you had set that book in England, Ireland, Scotland or Wales, we would have published it in a heartbeat. But because you set it in Australia, it makes that a little bit harder for us to sell to an international market. That was in the back of my mind when I created Joe O'Loughlin. When I sat down to write another novel, I thought, okay, the first one I set in Australia and it didn't get published. Let's set a book in the UK and see what happens. And that first novel, The Suspect, triggered a bidding war at the London Book Fair, and the rest is history, really.
Well, I'm sure from the calibre of the books that I've read that, we all know and love, it's not the fact that it's based in the UK, but that's obviously stayed well with you in the back of your mind.
Yeah, I lived and worked in the UK for nearly 12 years. Okay. And although Australia will always be home, I guess that's where I was first published. It was where, that's where I was sort of discovered really as a writer, even though I always intended to move back as we did to Australia about 21 years ago now. So it's funny, I travel into a lot of events in Australia, and a lot of people still think I'm British, and they come up to me and they say, how long are you here for? Is that when are you going back? And I have to remind them, no, I am an Aussie. I was born here. I was sort of born and bred in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. Now, before we get on to Joe, can I just ask you a little bit about the ghostwriting? Because as well as your journalist career, it must have been quite interesting writing for famous people. Are there any experiences that you can share with us?
I can mention some of the people I wrote for who sort of, some won't be that well known to an Australian audience. I mean, people that are well known, people like Lulu, the 60s pop star, who was, famous for a film To Serve With Love and the song, and she was a sort of absolute 60s, huge 60s it girl. Jerry Halliwell, just after she played the Spice Girls, I did her book. I did a lot of political and big SAS, big soldier sort of SAS boys' own adventures as well. Tony Bullimore, who we rescued from the Southern Ocean, the Yachtsman that was rescued now 21 years ago. It was just when my second daughter was born. I did his autobiography. Round the World Yachts woman, Tracy Edwards. I mean, there were 15 in total. As I said, some I can't mention, or I would have to kill you.
Yeah.
I just saw the secretly.
I'm pretty sure you'd know how to do that too, given your crime novel history.
I think I'd be terrible getting away with it.
So you've obviously had the journalistic career. What made you get into writing novels, particularly when you said before you didn't really think you had anything to write about? How did you come into this journey?
I guess, I felt as though Mark Twain had stolen all his best plots when it came to growing up in small towns. And, I had a very, very idyllic childhood. I guess the turning point in terms of the books I write now, the psychological thrillers, came about when one of the people I ghostwrote for was a man called Paul Britton, and he is the psychologist that the TV series Cracker was based upon. It was a wonderful BBC series with Robbie Coltrane playing a psychologist who was called in to help the police in investigations. And Jimmy McGovern, a very famous TV writer who wrote that series, he based it upon the work of Paul Britton. Now, I had written two autobiographies with Paul. One was called The Jigsaw Man, and he'd worked on cases like Fred and Rosemary West, The House of Horrors in Gloucester, Jamie Bolger, the little boy that was kidnapped from the supermarket in Bootle near Liverpool by the 11-year-old boys and murdered. And I mean, he, right through the 90s and 2000s, he was the pioneer of offender profiling in the UK. I mean, he was, the FBI were doing it in America. People like John Douglas were doing it. But in Britain, it was Paul Britton who was. And so having done, the first book was about his police work. The second book was about his work in places like Broadmoor and Rampton and secure psychiatric sort of hospitals where he had to make decisions every day about whether people should be released, could they be treated, were they the sort of people who had to be locked up for the rest of their lives because they were so badly damaged. And I guess so all that knowledge that Joe O'Loughlin has in the books, a lot of that came from having worked with Paul Britton because he was dealing with those sorts of cases all the time. And I suppose that was the turning point. I mean, I'd ghostwritten quite a number of books. I had about a 3-month window between having finished Roll Paris's autobiography and about to start Lulu. And I had about 3 months in which I thought, okay, why don't I create a character who's a psychologist? I have all this knowledge now. And so hence I created the Joe O'Loughlin character. And that book, triggered a bidding war at the London Book Fair in 2004. And I think sold into 21 translations in 3 hours.
You must be very proud of that.
It was like winning the lottery, really. I mean, writers, it's a tough job. The vast majority of writers in this country, I think the average income of a writer is less than $11,000 a year. Most have to do it part-time and do other jobs and whatever. So to have, in the space of 3 hours, to have had all my dreams come true, and I tell a story when you don't go to sleep after. And the phone was ringing at 3 a.m. saying that there were 5 American publishers bidding and 4 German publishers bidding, and the French have offered this, and the Italians have offered this, and you don't go to sleep after something like that. I remember my wife and I were still awake at sort of 7:30 in the morning, by which time we'd spent the money. And by 8 o'clock, we'd cast the Hollywood film, and by 8:30, the terror set in because I thought, oh my God, all of these people think I know. Because it wasn't even a full novel. It was 117 pages. It wasn't even a quarter of a novel. And they just bought it. It's like buying a house and just seeing a photograph of it. And it's so hugely flattering, but also very, I'm not saying I would want it to take it back, but also incredibly nerve-wracking.
Yeah. And that, I mean, that's gone from one book to 13, 9 of which have been the Joe O'Loughlin series. Did you ever imagine that it would become this behemoth?
No, honestly, because I mean, I tell you honestly, with Joe O'Loughlin, I mean, well, first of all, I mean, didn't. I thought, I imagined initially that, if I did manage to get a novel published, it would sell a dozen copies, and my mother would buy 8 of them, and I would go and continue on ghostwriting, and that would be, I was making a reasonable living doing that. And the other thing is that I didn't intend to write a series, and which is sort of self-evident in a sense. I mean, what sort of idiot who wanted to write a long-running series would give his main character early onset Parkinson's? I mean, it was completely counterintuitive to anyone that I had any imagination. I thought Joe would be in one book, and I thought the next novel, a bit like John Grisham did, I would write a completely different story. And it was only that the impact that Joe had, I mean, this man with a brilliant mind but a crumbling body, the anti-Jack Reacher and the anti-James Bond and the anti-Jason Bourne, the man, you knew he couldn't fight his way out of trouble or run or outfight or outrun or whatever.
Doesn't stop him trying to get into trouble, though.
That's true, but he had to outthink people. He had to use that brilliant mind of his to outthink people. And I guess what happened, after that publishers came to me after that first novel was delivered, and they said, "This is such a wonderful character, and you must carry him on." And so I didn't want to. I mean, so I compromised, and I actually, in the second novel, Lost, Joe becomes a minor character, and the policeman Vincent Ruiz becomes the main character. In the third novel, The Night Fair, Joe isn't in there at all. And I only brought Joe back in Shatter because it was when I came up with the idea behind Shatter, which is a very pure and very, very dark book, in a pure psychological thriller sense, because it was a perfect story for a psychologist to tell. This ultimate battle between a man who repairs damaged minds, that's what he does, Joe, against a villain who breaks minds, and it was that ultimate battle that I wanted to. And I often said the reason Joe kept coming back after that is that my wife refused to let me retire Joe until I sorted out his private life. She said, "You can't leave him. You can't leave him like this. You've got to keep going back until he's happy." So I spent all those other books trying to make Joe happy.
Well, you've not made your wife very happy in the 9th book without giving too much away.
I think I leave him in a good place, in a better place. I do terrible things to people I love, and I love Joe. I do terrible things to people.
So for our audience, let me get into Joe a little bit more. Obviously, you've gone for the fatal flaw of the main character, but why did you give him a condition like Parkinson's, or where did that come from? Because it's profound. Where did that come from, that decision?
It's funny, I feel a little embarrassed about it now because, I know a lot of people now who are sufferers and carers, and I get emails and letters and messages all the time from people that have PD or people that are caring or have lost someone or whatever. And I know far more about it. But when I went into it, honestly, I knew so little about Parkinson. All I was looking for really was there is a tragic irony about seeing someone like, for example, Muhammad Ali, who was the greatest athlete of my generation. When he lit the flame at the Atlanta Olympics, and this supreme athlete was this sort of shambling, sort of shaking figure. And it's like seeing someone like Stephen Hawking, this man, the greatest mind of our generation, or this century, the last century, trapped in a wheelchair in this withering body. It's like seeing a brilliant dancer who is suddenly struck down with arthritis, so I was looking for that something that would give Joe O'Loughlin that sort of tragic irony to him, a man with a brilliant mind, but a body that he couldn't rely upon. He wasn't going to be your normal hero who could outfight and outrun and outwoo and outdrive. And I guess I looked around and I thought, what am I going to give him? I mean, what condition will I give him? and because, it was, I thought I'd only do one book. I thought, well, how about I have him just diagnosed. It's early onset. He's 40 years old. I'll have him diagnosed. And so I didn't know, although I tell you this, there is a moment. The thing with ghostwriting was it was all about the moment you captured someone's voice, because when you wrote each new person, if you did your job properly, it looked and sounded and felt just like they were. It was their words. It was in their voice. And so when I create a fictional character like Joe O'Loughlin, he has to live and breathe in my imagination before he can live and breathe in your imagination. And I remember the moment when I got his voice, that slightly self-deprecating sense of humour. It's a line in the opening book. And it's a line that I took from a story that I read about someone with Parkinson's disease, a journalist with Parkinson's in New Zealand. And the opening line was something along the lines of, when I wake up every morning, I know what sort of day it's going to be if I can bend down and tie my shoes. And I thought, that is the voice. That is the voice I want. And so I gave Joe early onset Parkinson's. And, and it's funny, I mean, since then, obviously the research I've done, I communicate with lots of people, the sufferers. I've read obviously the Michael J. Fox books. I've read the research papers. I've read the blogs. Some amazingly funny blogs. There are stand-up comedians that have got PD. I follow people that are writing wonderful day-to-day sort of blogs about their trials and tribulations of living with this condition. And so I've learned a lot more about it. And I'm far more appreciative now of what a terrible burden that I've placed on Joe O'Loughlin. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible thing. I have such admiration for people who go through this. And hand on heart, I love Joe as a character. If I had my time over again, I wish I hadn't done it. I honestly, he wouldn't have been the same man though. I know it's terrible.
That's so true. He wouldn't have been the same man. And I think what you've done is, certainly for the people that I connect with and the Parkinson's community I connect with, they get a lot of hope from the character because he is so strong and so brave and obviously incredibly clever. And that's how people like to be portrayed with Parkinson's, is one part of their life, but not the defining feature of them.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things. I think that's true. And I think I do get I have appreciated so many of the messages I get. I think one of the advantages I had, because I have been very aware of, I put Joe through a lot, and I know that stress is one of the major complications that will exacerbate Parkinson's, and that's why, I created a use by date for Joe. There's a limit to what the man can do, and that book 9 may well be the last Joe O'Loughlin book. I'm not sure whether I'll do another one with him again.
I'd be very sad if you didn't. I know lots of others would too.
It's one of those things that it's potentially, I've left myself a window open that his daughter Charlie is studying to be a psychologist, that I could bring her. I mean, physically Joe just won't be able to. I mean, I'm aware of the fact I don't want to push it to the point where I have Joe physically doing things. He was diagnosed, I've aged him in real time. He was diagnosed in 2004. So it's 14 years, and far better than I do the progression of this. The one advantage I've had is that people progress at different rates, and everyone's symptoms are slightly different, and so you can't point to anyone and say, well, that couldn't be. But there's also, I appreciate the fact that I've tried to be so truthful about the way I've portrayed Parkinson's, and I don't want to stretch that to the point where those people look at me and say, well, now you've sort of jumped the shark. I mean, now there's no way after that many years he could be doing what you've got him doing. So I don't know. I mean, I love him, and he may well be he mentors someone else. I've got a younger psychologist in the book I'm writing now, and that Joe becomes more a mentor figure. He'll be there, but he won't be front and centre as much.
On that note, how do you put a character down and move on to another story and come back to pick him up later? How do you do that mentally?
Oddly enough, it's It's not that hard in the sense that, when I ghost wrote, I spent a year looking at the world inside someone else's head, looking at the world through their eyes, which is a wonderful opportunity. It's a gift to be given. But writing a first-person book, whether it be a ghost-written book or a Joe O'Loughlin novel, it's his voice. I'm looking at the world through his eyes. I'm trying to experience his emotions. It's sort of like living in a two-man tent with your best friend for a year, and it doesn't matter how good a friend they are. After that year, you sort of want to have a break.
Yep.
Because and it's hard to get their voice out of your head.
Mm.
But what I've tried to do over the last sort of probably 5 or 6 years is I do a couple of standalone, and then I'll come back and do a Joe book, and I'll give myself a break.
Right.
Because and also, it's one of those things that each time I introduce Joe, I've got to find a new way. I don't want people to say, yeah, a bit like the last book, though, wasn't it? I want to find a new story, a new way of introducing him. And I mean, readers are funny creatures. I love them because they love a character, an ongoing character, because it's like putting on their favourite pair of slippers and they're sitting in their favourite reading chair and they're back with an old friend. But if the book is too much like the last one, they will go, yeah, no, I liked it. It was good. It's okay. But a bit the same. I don't want to. I sort of want someone to tap me on the shoulder and say, Michael, move on, before I reach that point where I'm sort of writing the same story.
Which can put a lot of pressure on you. Given that you know your characters so intimately, do you feel that there's a finite number of characters that you can have and create?
No, I think that's the beauty of fiction, really, that you can keep creating new ones. And one of the things that I was taught by Paul Britton, the psychologist, that even when he was treating people like, let's say Fred West, Fred, this man who murdered so many people along with his wife, there are so many layers to people's personalities. Someone like Fred West, it's not just I've been three-dimensional. It's almost like we are all, multi-dimensional people who have layers of personality, and we all keep secrets. There are things that you have never told people. There are secrets you will never tell anyone. We all have those, and that's what makes people so fascinating. That's why, in terms of writing crime, I wasn't interested in forensics and how many times someone got stabbed or blood stains on a wall. I wanted to know what was going through the mind of the person that committed that crime, what was going through the mind of the victim, what impact it has on the investigators, on the families, on the neighbours. I wanted to investigate how crime ripples through a community. I know people that grew up in Adelaide in that same period when the Beaumont children went missing. The 3 children went missing. And these friends of mine were never taught to ride a bike because their parents were terrified that if they rode a bike, they'd ride around the corner and never come back. That's how a crime, it changes communities. And I'm interested in all of those sort of factors psychologically. And in the case of Joe with Parkinson's, it was how that impacted on his thought processes, the different stages of grieving that he went through, the denial and the railing against the unfairness and coming to terms with it. And I wanted to investigate all of those things and try to do it honestly.
And the relationships that you've created, I particularly love the relationship between Joe and Vincent. Does that stem from strategy, or is that what you like to read yourself? Is it more about the relationships that you like to read, or is it more plot-driven content?
I don't plot the books in advance, so I never know how a book's going to end when I start it. I just start with a premise, and and just sort of, the most recent one, The Other Wife, that you mentioned, I just started with that premise. What if Joe O'Loughlin turned up at hospital to see, after his father had been savagely bashed, expecting to find his mother at the bedside, but in fact found a strange woman covered in blood who announces that she's his other wife. That was the seed of it. And I thought, wow, okay, I can run with that one. That's a story. And it's funny. I think the Vincent character is interesting. I think it's like a lot of, you know, buddy films or those things. You need a foil. You need. And Joe O'Loughlin, something his wife said, Julianne said about Joe early on, and she said, "Why can't you be the person that runs away from trouble, yelling for help? Why are you always the person that runs towards it, trying to?" And he's a man who can't say no. He's a reluctant investigator. I didn't want someone that worked with the police. I wanted someone who had to be dragged every time reluctantly into this because he just wants to do his job as a clinical psychologist. He doesn't want to deal with madmen or deal with murder. But that sense of humanity meant he did get himself into trouble. And that moment in each story where Vincent shows up, I know from the reader's point of view, they always relax a little more, thinking, okay, it's okay now, because if Joe gets into trouble, Vincent will be there. Somewhere along the line, Vincent's going to make sure that Joe doesn't get in too deep.
So given that you started The Other Wife with not a lot of strategy, I'm going to guess obviously that the whole series, once you had the suspect sorted, that there was no strategy with the progression. It was just starting each book and off you went.
Yeah, none whatsoever. And so in terms of all I know, you know, in that first novel, he's got a daughter, Charlie, who's 8 years old. You know, in the most recent novel, Charlie is 20 years old. So the readers that have read that series have watched her grow up. You know, they've watched Joe's sort of marriages sort of, you know, falter. They've watched all sorts of things happen. And all I did really was there is a progression to life. I mean, you are not the same person you were at the age of 7 or at 17 or at 27. And we all, you know, it's one of the things I noticed when I was ghostwriting, or I had to learn, is that you can't make someone who's a child have the same knowledge and sensibility as someone who is, you know, is in their 40s or 50s. You have to try to look at the world as they would look at it as a child. And so there is a natural progression. So Joe, he's not the same man that he was, you know, when we first met him at 40. You know, he's older and wiser. He's broken. His Parkinson's has got worse. You know, he's been through the mill, really. But we're never the same people. We all go through, in a full life, we all go through that mixture of tragedy and euphoria and joy. And that's the great thing about leading a full life. I don't think it's possible for someone to say, I just want to have a happy life, because to me, a happy life means a full life. It means you get a bit of everything, because if it was nothing but plain sailing, God, it'd be boring.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, you say you regret in some ways giving Joe Parkinson's, and yet he's led a very full life. And I think, despite everything and the reluctance, he's led a very full life.
You know, I guess it's the main reason I say it, really. The only reason I said that was because the number of people with Parkinson's I've met over the years, they come along to my events and things like that. You know, and it's like people have said to me, you know, I've mentioned that I'm going to, you know, that I'm going to sort of put him aside for at least a book, you know, and do a standalone and then make a decision, you know. It's almost as though, you know, I want someone out there, and I know some of the leading Parkinson's researchers in this country. I want someone out there to come up with a cure, not for my character, but for all the other sufferers. And that way, you know, Joe gets that benefit too, but I want it for all the people, the true champions and the true, you know.
That's a lovely sentiment.
Yeah.
Well, I've taken up plenty of your time. I can see you've got your mini golf in the background. I wouldn't want to pull you away from your writing or your mini golf.
No, I'm in the midst of writing a very important scene. There you go.
Are you? Well, look, can I just say thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Me, personally, I absolutely adore your books. I've loved them all. I really hope that there's another Joe O'Loughlin in there, but we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
There never will be, but I think for the next book, at least, he won't be in the next one. The one I'll finish now, the one I'm writing now, he may make it. Well, so when you say he's not in it, he makes an appearance. There's reference to him in the new book, which is a lovely little moment where you think, he's not gone forever, but he's just not really in that.
Not yet. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We're looking forward to the release of your next book mid-next year, and maybe we'll see Joe come back down the track in the future.
Thank you. You take care.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.